And to speak a little bit further about this is political analyst Dr. Dale McKinley. A very good evening to you, Dr. McKinley. Thank you so much for speaking to us. That alarm sounded by President Cyril Ramaphosa on the ramifications of South Africa pursuing this case at the ICJ. Some may poo-poo it and say it's a flight of fancy, but just how far-fetched is it, given the global North's historical past when it comes to African leaders who are seen not to toe the line?
First of all, good evening to Piso and to the viewers. Yeah, listen, I think there's two aspects here. One, yes, there will be some blowback. There's certainly going to be pushback. We've already seen it, whether it's from Israel, the United States, or other European countries which have backed the Israeli government and Netanyahu to a hilt. They want to put pressure on South Africa. They don't like the case that was brought. We can see it on the economic front. We can see it on the political front. And the Israeli government in particular has a history of sort of, we say, spying and spying equipment and making, other intervening and selling software to other countries in order for disinformation and misinformation. This is nothing new. So those possibilities exist. On the other hand, what Cyril Ramaphosa is saying, I think, is a bit of an exaggeration. First of all, it's quite, I think, instructive that he uses the words regime change, because this is not a regime. This is a democratically elected government, and democratically elected governments can be voted out of power. My sense is that the ANC is going to use this, which is not surprising politically, to bolster its electoral chances. And that, I think, is something that we should expect. But I don't think that there is any real possibility that you're going to see some more serious kind of overt intervention in the South African political process, although we might see it behind the scenes.
Okay. There's so many things that I want you to pin in that conversation, and we'll get to the issue of the distinction between democracy and regime change. There was a meeting at the Victoria Falls in 2016. Frelimo, the ANC, Chama cha Mapinduzi, ZANU-PF, and even SWAPO, speaking about fears of regime change by the West. And a lot of these conversations have also been as a result of ideological differences when it comes to the economic direction or nationalist policies that some of these governments have wanted to pursue.
Well, sure. I think that's sort of what we would call, or people on the left would call, an imperialist agenda is nothing new. This has been going on since in the post-independence period. We saw it with structural adjustment programs being forcibly implemented by the IMF and the World Bank in many, many African countries over this in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. We've seen a lot of pressure put. So I think that is to be expected. However, what we have to see is the other side of that coin, which is that many of these governments themselves have performed very, very badly. They have not delivered to their citizenry. They have cracked down on dissent. They have basically attempted to keep in power at all costs. I mean, all we have to do is look north of the border with ZANU-PF. We can look at the MPLA in Angola. We can look at Frelimo in Mozambique. And there's many, many criticisms that can be made. So in the debate that is to be had, on the one hand, yes, there is the Western countries that are going to always try to influence the African countries for basic economic and political purposes. That's to be expected. But on the other hand, that does not excuse, nor does it cover up, the absolute failings of South African and other regional governments to basically govern properly. So they're not just unpopular sometimes in the West, they're unpopular with their own electorate.
All right, so let's take the conversation further. Rwanda, for instance, one of those countries that is now being lauded in terms of the level of development and advancement it's achieved. But you know yourself that for many occasions, President Paul Kagame has been called an autocrat. And I'm also looking back at a piece written by the ISS when we talk about the difference between democracy and regime change, looking at liberation struggle movements, particularly in the southern hemisphere, but particularly Southern Africa, as saying it's basically a band of governments that are nostalgic for the backward liberation struggle policies that they want to hang on to. And some would actually call that the dark Africa moniker or sentiment that's been used to criticize African governments. Your thoughts on this?
Yeah, so I think that, first of all, there are legitimate criticisms to be made of many, many African governments, including those that are ruled by juntas, military juntas that have overthrown democratically elected governments, and including governments themselves, which have spent more on the military and security and more on themselves and building white elephant projects than they have on their very own people and delivering services. So rather than call people necessarily, I think in the context of saying that the ex-liberation governments themselves have a very mixed track record. On one hand, for example, let's say in Zimbabwe, in the 1980s and 90s, there was quite a lot of progress with regards to social services, education, health, and others. Much of that has been reversed in the last 20 years. And yes, while there have been pressure, there's been sanctions, there's been other ideological battles that have gone on, I don't think that that excuses, nor, as I said, should that cancel out the very real problems that we have here in South Africa in governance, and our electoral realities at the moment are testimony to that. Okay. The fact is that regardless of what the West says or does, or regardless of what Israel does, an increasing number of the South African population has lost faith in the ANC and has taken away their support. That's why the ANC is speaking like it is, because they are afraid that for the first time in 30 years, they could lose power. And I think that's a lot of what drives ex-liberation movements to do the things they do, is because they prize power over anything else.
And I want to, notwithstanding what you're saying and not ignoring what you're raising, but I also want the viewers to understand the plausibility of that reality of the West imposing regime change. You spoke about espionage earlier on, and various African governments have raised the questions, and there's been much debate about international financial institutions and how they use their policies through aid to strong-arm African governments to change their national agendas or development plans. South Africa recently been hot water with the United States over having Vladimir Putin as the Russian president here for BRICS. So is it improbable to say the private sector or the free market could be used to drive regime change, however insidious?
No, of course it's not improbable. We've seen examples of this happening across the world over the last 20 or 30 years. We've seen several examples in Latin America. We've seen some examples in Asia. But let me say clearly that those are imperial agendas, and imperial agendas are not specific to the United States or Europe. So, for example, Russia and China, particularly in the last 10 or 15 years, in their own spheres of influence, are doing fairly similar kinds of things, putting massive economic pressure, in some cases military pressure, on other governments in order to bend them to what they would like in their own agendas. So I think the critique is absolutely correct, which is an anti-imperialist critique, and one that says that the developing world, the world in the global south, is generally at a disadvantage economically and politically, precisely because of colonialism, precisely because of 200 or 300 years of domination from the north and from the developed world, so to speak. And this is not going away anytime soon. So it's a difficult debate, because on the one hand, you have to acknowledge that reality. On the other hand, you need to acknowledge, and for those of us who live in these countries, like South Africa in the global south, we have to acknowledge the fact that those that we've elected and those that purport to represent us have not oftentimes done a very good job, including, that's why we cannot blame the ESCOM crisis purely on imperialism. We cannot blame the port situation purely on imperialism. We can blame some things, but we have to also take responsibility, and I think that's where the balance lies.